So I'm just going to tell you what we planned to do in the next 45 minutes is that I will tell you a little bit about my work, what I do, and how I even came to be invited to have this conversation with Velvet tonight, and about one particular concept that I had developed for a text that was commissioned by ArtEZ. Then I have prepared a few questions to Velvet, and we're going to have a little conversation about, whatever comes up, and then we would also like to invite you to ask questions. I'm just going to say very little about my background, which is very different from Velvet's, namely because I'm a theorist and not an artist. But I actually do work a lot with artists, and also my theory is very much inspired by artworks and by art practices and by people who make art. And what I'm hoping with my theory is also that my theory that I developed, that it is also inspiring for artists or for art practices. So that might be the link to why I'm here tonight. Part of my work, or most of my work, revolves around non-normative embodiment, which includes themes that we've just encountered, namely queerness and disability or illness, and other forms of embodiment. And I'm also interested in embodied knowledge production through non-normative embodiment. What I'm interested in is, however, not the bodies themselves, but how they're perceived as non-normative. And I'm also interested in how to change this perception about what we think might be non-normative about bodies. So I'm interested in how we read bodies as non-normative in the first place. And we read them, that's my theory, as non-normative, not because of any attributes they might have or fail to have, but because we are trained to make sense of them in specific ways. So we only read them as non-normative, is my theory, because we read them through dichotomies, which means we read them as either black or white, rather than as black and white or anything in between. We read them as sick or healthy, rather than a mix of everything. And we read them through exclusions. So we read them as being in or out of a group, or as fitting or misfitting a specific category. And we read them through power relations, which means that we categorize them as either being weak or strong, or economically productive or unproductive, or through patriarchal structures. So my theory is not necessarily about bodies, but about how we perceive them. And so societal institutions like, for example, medical care or medical sciences and practice, but also schools, education, religions, and even art institutions very much rely on those reading practices that are very exclusionary. But they also support these sense-making tools. And they support these sense-making tools not only for bad reasons. So, for example, medical care very often, of course, dichotomizes bodies so that they can take care of those bodies. But at the same time, of course, what they're doing, they're also controlling those bodies by saying you're in or out, or you're healthy or sick, etc. All right. So now what I'm interested in is in these, what I call reading practices of bodies. And so I focus on how we read bodies and not necessarily on my focus is not necessarily on the bodies themselves. And that allows me to identify what could be called the non-normative, even if it even exists, in the relationship between the reading and the read body. So instead of having to focus on one body that might be called or read non-normative, I can now focus on the relationship between the body that reads and the body that is being read. And of course, it's not ever just two bodies. There's always more, right? There's a surrounding, there's a discourse, there's language, there's more than two bodies in a room, etc. But so what I want to stress is that I'm interested in the relationship that takes place in this reading of the body. And it also allows me to then rethink and transform social practices that determine how bodies are being perceived. So I'm not so much interested in thinking about how we change individual bodies so that they fit the norm better, but I'm more interested in how we can change social practices, which, you know, I think might have an endless variety of how they could be and how they could be different from what we do now. So also what I want to stress is what is important in my theory is that I think that the reading of bodies is not primarily dependent on what I see. So I'm not interested necessarily in the object of perception, but more on how I see. So the reading bodies is then a relational act because it involves always the perceived, which would be the visual object, and the perceiving body, which would be the act of seeing. And it involves also the context within which that seeing takes place. And so here I would want to quote Judith Butler with a very, very small quotation, where Butler once said, "The body is less an entity than a relation." And so this is where my theory is built on, that the body itself, in fact, is a relation and not just what's going on between bodies. So this is a little bit the basis of, of my approach to how I want to read bodies. Now, what's the link to art? I'm getting there. I don't know about time. I'm probably taking much longer than I thought. It's okay.
No, it's fine. You're fine.
So my idea is that artwork, it's not only my idea, it's also artists' idea, I think, that artworks have the capacity to influence how we look by appealing to my own bodily involvement in that looking. So art can basically, you know, if it wants to, or if it has the capacity to, it can reveal basically its own doing in reminding me, you know, how the looking happens that I do when I look at an artwork. And so critical disability studies scholar Tobin Siebers once said, art perception involves both perception of the artwork and self-perception. So I think this is the strength of art in when it comes to the kind of theories that I want to develop, is that art brings in a possibility or a capacity or a capability of a looking or of a visual economy that is special because it makes us aware of who in fact is involved in the looking process, and that it's always myself as the looking subject, but it's also the artwork that is involved. And so here again we speak about that relation of the perceived object and the looking subject. And so I come to a concept that I've developed or in a text that was commissioned by ArtEZ for a wonderful publication that you should all read. It's still in the process of being published, I think. It's called Power Tools for Young Artists, and the idea was, and that was the invitation that I got, is to write an essay that is informed by my theory, but that is actually useful for young artists to be used in their artistic practice. And I thought, how on earth would I ever be able to do that? You know, like no one can do that, it's impossible. And at least of me, because I'm such a head person. Anyway, so I tried to do that, and what I came up with was this concept that, of course, kind of was based in earlier theories that I had developed, but that I developed specifically for this article, which which is called vulnerable looking. And maybe important to know about this concept that it is in fact a theoretical concept nonetheless, right? So it's not yet art, or will never be. It's theory still. So it's a theoretical concept, but that was developed for the use of artists in their artistic practices. And that, of course, would be, for me, the best thing that ever could happen is that artists can actually work with that concept, can actually make it dirty and transform it and use it and break it. What I also think is interesting about this concept is that it's a visual concept. So it refers to a lot of visual theories, but also it allows us to rethink visual practices. So it's a visual concept that kind of turns on itself and tries to rethink what visuality actually can do, and what it might incorporate, namely other forms of perception, which also brings me back later to your performance, Velvet. What does looking include, or what does visuality include, rather than just seeing, for example? So this concept of vulnerable looking is built on two main principles that are important. One is that vulnerability is not just a state of weakness or exposure to violence, but that it is also the capacity for a radical openness and responsiveness to the world, which we have also very beautifully seen in your performance. So vulnerability allows subjects not only to be affected, for example, by risk or exposure to violence, but also it allows subjects to affect others. So vulnerability here is a more complicated concept and a more productive one, you could say, with more agency. The second principle that is important in this concept is that looking is not only a physiological reaction to sensory stimulation, but a social cultural practice that comes with political agency and ethical responsibility. So the idea here is that looking is never neutral. I think I have this sentence that is so simple from Paulo Freire, an educator, who once said, education is not neutral. And so here I'm just using it again. So looking is never neutral. It has effects on what we think we see and on what we actually see, so on the subject we see. So these two principles about vulnerability being more than just a state of weakness and looking being more than just a physiological process, but actually something which comes with politics and ethical responsibility as well, is important. So the idea is, of course, that looking as a cultural practice can be engaged differently in order to transform how we read so-called non-normative bodies. That's what it boils down to. Very simple, but very complicated. And so now the question is, how does queerness, disability, and art figure in this concept, and how do they come in? So art, as we already saw before, can involve viewers in the production of their own sight. So art can make us aware of our own involvement in what we see. And art could also be called, like Tobin Sieber said, a mode of perception. So art itself can be a mode of perception. And disability and queerness in art, we could say, could open up new modes of perception, alternative modes of perception, where disability reminds us particularly that vision itself, so the process of looking, is always anyway unstable, dependent on others, prone to blindness or partiality and violence. And queerness in art, for example, can remind us that there are bodily experiences that exist, yet have always remained socially unrecognized. So queerness in art can remind us that there is maybe something that is invisible, but still there. And which again kind of reminds us that looking is not something that reveals something to us necessarily about the world, but only something that, you know, we were made to see, you could say. All right, what I do now is to try to relate very briefly to the exhibition, which I only saw today for the first time, but it's such a pleasure to also have Marika here, who is a former student of mine, who is the curator of this exhibition, and I'm so proud. And anyway, what I thought, you know, I want to mention, which is also something that relates also to your performance, Velvet, is that what I found, you know, like, and this is very simplifying my experience that I had this morning, is that what I found interesting is that, for example, R.A. Walden created a language, a specific language, within which the word for body also always simultaneously means home and planet. So the idea that body is never just body, but it's also home and planet, so it has something that always incorporates the environment, the context, and one's own subjectivity. So this idea that someone actually lives in that body, you know, the life, I think is interesting and so beautiful, because it relates to what I just said about the idea that the body is always a relation. It's never just an object, you could say, or it's never just a subject either. And so in Ayla Steinberg's work, what I found is that the body's life, as it's presented here, is always in relation to its own death or its own afterlife. So there's never a bodily life that is not in relation to what happens when it's not there anymore. And there, of course, the question of illness comes in particularly. And also at the same time, it's of course subjected to the effects of medical science and technology, which very much deals with also not the life itself of a body, but, you know, what is said about it or what is meant for it to happen. And in Phelim Hui's work, what I find interesting is that it exposes the body's relation to expectations of autonomy and independence, but also to functionality and structure. And there again, I feel, you know, what we can see is a sort of trying to make sense of precisely that relation a body is in, and that we usually forget about that relation because we just function in a very normative way. So in the sense of, you know, like we know that we can walk on two legs when we have those two legs and have been trained to walk on them in a specific way. But what happens if that all of a sudden that structure gets out of turn? Then we become aware that our relationship to the floor we might have been standing on becomes much more important, right? Or some other kind of structure that we can hold on to. So in general, I think themes that are recurring are also the idea that the body and technology are very much related to each other and actually build a relation. And also body and language build a relation. And that's how I want to come to your performance. So that's my lead in. The first question, I'm just going to say a little bit about my thoughts I had about your title, because I think your title is absolutely amazing. And of course, I knew the title before I saw your work, today live. And so I made a few notes about how I thought I connected the parts of the title with, you know, like what I hadn't yet seen, but which I was kind of expecting to see. So maybe you are saying it's completely different. And I would invite you to then also say something about your choice of title and what you think about it. So I was interested in the visceral as that which I kind of located in the hidden, in the internal bodily experiences of illness, which your performance conveys or shows, but which remain totally invisible to the audience. So there's something that we can all sense and feel and know about without actually seeing it. So that for me made this connection to the idea that visuality is not just about vision, but that there is a lot more, which is very much embodied in several senses, that I translated as that viscerality that you mentioned in your title. Then the virtual, to me, seems to reside in that which I try to identify as the gap between the words that are on the placard, so what the placards actually say, and what they might mean to you in a specific situation, or what they might mean even to the audience when they encounter the words. So something about language that says something, and something else is happening, and there seems to be a gap in between, but not necessarily a negative gap, but something that kind of opens a space to dwell in when one is dealing with all kinds of experiences of embodiment that one cannot make sense of, maybe. And the vulnerable in your artistic choices of the performance, of course, are interesting, as also putting an individual, a personal experience in a sort of public space. I never know if art spaces are supposed to be called public spaces, but I know that when you're on stage in a space like this, it feels like a public space, right? So that's what I'm saying. And I'm saying it's maybe not public precisely because it's also a very limited kind of audience that we have, and we all know that, right? So it's a very specifically informed audience, which is also nice, but yeah. And also the vulnerable is also, for me, in the dissolving of the border between stage and audience, which you so beautifully managed to do here, where the stage isn't separate from the audience space. Well, anyway, so I'm curious to hear what you want to say about the title and maybe also about trifecta.
Okay. Thank you. Gosh, so many wonderful things in everything you said that I could pick up on. So where to begin? But with trifecta, I mean, I think for me I make a bit of a distinction that for me the performance is trifecta. Mm-hmm. And I think of like the whole evening with then trifecta, the visceral, the vulnerable, and the visceral, the virtual, and the vulnerable. And those three terms also within the idea of trifecta as a triad or as a trio. But when we were planning this event, we had some conversations about whether there would be a live stream element. And in my performance work, I feel very consequent that it's experienced in the room by the people who are in the room. But then in trying to think about at the time we were planning also, there was the possibility that maybe in a short time before the night of the event, because of COVID, all of a sudden we couldn't have a live event. So if we have to shift to online, so then for me, I was trying to think about if I would take these ideas that I'm working with in the performance and assemble them in a way to be experienced virtually, I would make a different work. And I would think about the medium through which the work is being conveyed, so that the live performance is different from something that I would share on the internet. And so for me, the visceral is very much then about what is happening in the exchange of the live. So I'm interested in the question of what can art do, and what different forms of art do, how they function in different ways. So there is something about an affective resonance in the live performance that, for me, I feel consequent just doesn't simply translate into a live stream version. But then this question of vulnerability, how does it travel in different forms, in different ways? So there I came to this title. And then along the way, in the end, we don't have a live stream, but maybe I should also say that I got then interested in it because of what would I do in a way that could be virtual, especially because of the topic of chronic illness or disability,
and I'm very interested in the question of audience.
I'm very, very interested in audience. Who's in the room? How did they come to be in the room? What did you read that sparked your interest? And then I also know that there's an enormous audience who cannot physically be able to be in the room. So somehow I have this, there's an unrealized like seed of a project here, which would be to do an event that is, because in my imagination at one point I had, there's going to be the live event happening in the room, then there's going to be some film or sound score that's available online for a remote audience to experience simultaneously. And then we can have the conversation afterwards. And I got very excited by this idea that there would be a remote audience who's experiencing, like there's kind of then multiple audiences who are experiencing a similar thing in a different way, and the awareness that there are other people experiencing a similar thing in a different way at the same time, and then that this then would like open or widen your understanding of, each of us in looking, in making sense of what we see, what we experience. We encounter similar stimuli, but how we assemble it, it's not the same. And then the third part of that trifecta of the live event, the virtual event, would be the like afterlife of the event, which will happen. There will be an edited version of this online later, which is a different thing than what's happening now. So that's...
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I still think that the virtual, even though you kind of said that it wasn't now anymore in the performance, but it still is somehow for me precisely because of the medium of performance and where potentially there's always something that is already gone before I had a chance to grasp it. So it's real, it's there, it exists, but it's not visible, or it's not maybe recognized as being there. Yeah. Nice. So to link to the last part of the title, which is of course the vulnerable, I want to also ask you about your artistic choice of doing a performance, because of course performance counts as, like this one particular art form, which on the one hand is interesting because it's so ephemeral, because it can actually not be documented really, and at the same time because it puts bodies on stage, at least in general, or if it puts bodies on stage, it makes these bodies very, very vulnerable. And so it can, I think, as in relation maybe to other art forms, elicit reactions in the audience that are either sympathetic with that vulnerable body or with the vulnerability of the subject that is on stage. It can elicit reactions of empathy or also violence. I'm just thinking of all the body artists, the famous body artists that elicited and provoked specific forms of violence because that's what they wanted to experiment with. And so of course I'm interested in maybe if you can say more about not necessarily which kind of response you wanted to provoke, because maybe you didn't want to provoke anything in the first place, but I'm interested in how, because you said you were interested in what your art or what can art do. So if it does that it elicits like empathic or sympathetic or violent responses, what would be that which you would be interested in?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll come to that, but I also wanted to say that in terms of trifecta came to me as a name for the performance because at a certain moment I had a previous title that wasn't sitting right with me, and then trifecta sort of presented itself to me, and very much it's also because of the great achievement that being chronically ill actually is, and how much work and labor and endurance and strength and capacity and all these kinds of things that aren't associated or are maybe normatively thought as an ill or sick body doesn't have these capacities, but actually does, but they're completely in a different way. So naming it trifecta was really like, it's a huge achievement to live in a body that is unreliable and to find a way to function in the world when, you just can't count on what you can do. And it relates, I think, then also very much to what you're saying in terms of the social practices that also then are limiting what bodies can do or how they can move and be in space.
What's happening inside my brain right now? What is the body doing, in fact? The synapses, the neurons, the blood-brain barrier.
But so to come back to the question you asked about, sympathy and empathy or violence, I think that in my work I am kind of trying to do simultaneously two different things. So I think I'm trying to do two different things simultaneously, or at least two different things. And for me, it relates very much on the relational question of who is in the audience and who is looking and what is there, from what perspective or position in life are they. And if I go with a dichotomy of like a more privileged or a less privileged body, or a more able or a less able body, that I'm dealing with personal content, and I'm trying to arrange it in a way where it maybe hangs a little bit further away from me and a little bit less specified, trying to open space so that people can have an effective resonance, and maybe it speaks to something that in their own world, or it presents something that confronts them with like, that's an experience I don't know is out there in the world, but so, kind of to say like, there's many experiences that you don't have knowledge of or access to, but without having to kind of draw, leaving the space for opacity, without having to like put people under the spotlight. And I mean, for myself as a performer and in the body that I'm in, I'm very interested in using what is, perceived as a very normative body, depending on who's looking, to then, in a performative way, kind of rupture this idea of visual representation as conveying all kinds of truth. So kind of trying to like pull the curtain aside and keep it closed.
It changes you forever. The body is never the same again. And there is that shift now also, that I speak now of my body as its own thing, somewhat distant from me and yet all-consuming. What it is doing, what are its needs. These have a force and a presence now that exceeds me. My body has an existence that is somehow distinctly not me, and yet within which I am inextricably entangled.
Depending on the context in which I'm performing, then the question of being more overtly challenging or confrontational comes into question. And maybe also, just for context, I mean, most of my performance, I'm speaking. So I made a specific choice here that in the course of my body did not speak.
What will my body do? Where is my body at? And oftentimes the answer to, will I be able to do this thing tomorrow, the next day, next week, or next month is, I just don't know. I really couldn't say.
But because of the content, I made a specific choice to not, for my performing body in the moment of the performance, to not have a voice. And that was a very intentional choice. I don't know how much I've gotten to the like sympathy and empathy and violence, but maybe, I don't know.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Velvet.
Yeah. Thank you.
It was very nice to talk to you, and I hope that you also like to talk to us.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, if it makes it any easier, maybe you want to respond to the question that Velvet has about their work, and I have about my work, which is, what can art do and what can theory do? In the sense, and this is a very meta question, which we will never be able to answer like this because it's not universal. But maybe you like to just say what it did to you.
So in response to what did I experience, I have experienced periods of chronic illness myself, and it really took me back to indeed like the struggle, the agency, the way you're speaking now about the strength of a body, or the skill that it involves to live in a body that is unreliable. Really moved me and made me aware of the social struggle of communicating that. So the social struggling of communicating that, and then to talk with Jules in a social world that thinks of this along the lines of a dichotomy. You are either or not functioning, or you are either or not capable. And I was cooking up a question, something I struggle with myself, talking with students who are new to thinking about diversity in bodies. I struggle greatly in trying to talk about the way that bodies are judged in a normative way along the lines of a dichotomy without reinforcing the dichotomy. And this is something I'm constantly sort of stumbling over, where I hear myself trying to have this discussion or to open up the way we are thinking about this. And then I can sort of hear myself repeating binary oppositions of black and white, able, not able. So I was wondering if from an artistic point of view, there are solutions different from my pedagogical, didactical solutions. I would like to just take the time to ask for advice.
Well, I mean, I think that in the way that I work, and this is also, I think, like integrally close following line of like queer practice, is to like open things up but not pin them down. So but yeah, I'm not sure if I have an answer for you, unfortunately, that can help you, because the thing that I think that art can do is to push at the edges of those understandings, but without having them so specifically delineated. And when you're talking about teaching and you're using language to instruct or to explain or to describe, you're kind of like, it's a double bind. Like you can't get out of it because you're trying to undo the thing that you're doing at the same time that you're doing it. And so I was saying to Jules earlier today in an email that I'm very inspired by a quote from Ursula Le Guin talking about I'll misquote her, but saying something about like the artist whose medium is the novel is trying to do in words what cannot be done in words. And because my work is mostly text-based, I take that on. It's like, okay, if the artist whose primary medium is language, how to do in language or what cannot be done. And I'm really interested in trying to like do power differently in language. So yeah, I don't have a specific answer, but it's like you kind of have to like talk at the topic and then around it, and or through it, or yeah.
Yeah, you are describing the struggle very
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just very quickly to relate, because I mean I encounter this problem all the time, and I think it comes not only with the problem of language and how we use it, but also with the problem of pedagogy, which still seems to assume that there's someone who knows and someone who doesn't yet know, and that we kind of first. Sorry? Pedagogy. Teaching.
Theory of teaching.
Yeah. So we first would need to get rid of the power relations involved in pedagogy, I think, in order to find a common ground already with our students, I think, and that's a task that I think is so necessary and it's so difficult. But then I think we could kind of arrive at a space that we encounter today where language comes in very prominently, but then kind of creating precisely this gap of what language can mean and what it says and how it's experienced. And I think that gap, that for me creates a space within which we can dwell in different ways, is brought in by bodily sensation, by bodily experience. And so we need the body there as well, I think.
I mean, I think maybe to come back to like when I'm talking with people, I'm constantly trying to think about the words that I use to not make limitations. So a simple example, I'm riding my bicycle with a work colleague I don't know very well, and we're riding bicycles somewhere for the first time, and on the front of their bicycle there's a child seat. And so I say to them, is there a little person in your life? Yes, and it's clearly like their little person. And then I say, like, is that a project that you're doing alone or together with another person? You know, which like, there's no, it's not about, are you married? It's not about, are you hetero, you know, it's using the language in a way that allows for whatever their specific situation is, they can answer into the question. And then I know something, you know, but without, so also sidestepping then any difficulty or discomfort for someone to have to say, oh yeah, no, but I'm XYZ, and then to have to pin themselves down into a certain identity category as well.
I think there's maybe one caveat that I have for all kinds of artistic strategies that I think would be very useful to deal with this problem that I'm also encountering, which is when it comes to politics. I think once we need to act in an activist way, or if we really need to make a political statement, then we actually have to choose sometimes to use those dichotomies as a sort of counterweight to the economies that we're struggling
Sometimes
with or
you have
in.
to name them to know that they are there. If they are something you want to be aware of.
Exactly. So I'm thinking maybe
that we're dealing with. You use the word reader, reading and readership of bodies, and we are also, I think, talking about spectatorship and the way that we are looking at bodies in a performance such as this, and that in education. It also, even using language that leaves a lot of room not to pin identities down or bodies down. Education also involves students who already have a literacy of those dichotomies that they bring. Mm-hmm. That means that, so my words are also like a body performance. Yeah. They can be open to so many realities, but if the listener is thinking through oppositions.
Yeah. Yes. So the education then becomes to kind of unlearn these socially constructed ways of seeing, because then you see what you're trained to see, and if you don't know that there's something else beyond that scope of what you see, you're only going to see what you already know how to see. So that the vulnerable looking, as I understand it, and when I you know, when Cataline first connected us, and I read the essay, I was like, this is what I'm trying to do actually in my work, is to expand the frame of understanding that, like, okay, there's things beyond what I know. There's whole ways of being and doing in the world beyond what I know, and when I see how I'm looking and what I'm already like projecting as to, you know, if I'm already projecting the way, you know, my lens, then that's what I'm gonna see, and I'm not gonna see what else is out there, and maybe I can open space to in my own awareness for what I can't see, and maybe you don't need to see it.
I've been worrying in the past 2+ years about this long COVID situation not being on the agenda of our politicians, not realizing it was happening to you too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's also hard if you're bedridden to speak out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how many long COVID sufferers there are or have been. So because it's not investigated.
Yeah,
That's frankly shocking. So I know the story you presented is. I know many of the words that you were suggesting. The brain fog is one of the obvious ones. Yeah. So that hits me.
Yeah. I mean, maybe to give a little bit of context, because Dave and I know each other quite a long time, and indeed, my performance is based on my experience of having long COVID, which it's never specifically said in, so the performance is also intentionally structured in a way that there's never a name or specific. So the first time I did it, one of the people who was responding to me, you know, immediately said that it reminded her of when her mother was ill. I don't know if she even said what illness, but so that there's this kind of protracted illness of what happens with the body. But indeed, it's based on my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting there is really this idea that we can actually not deal with the chronic.
Mm.
So it can be long COVID, it can be other chronic illnesses where, like we cannot deal with the idea that a body is not able to or not willing to or cannot heal, and can never kind of reconstitute the norm that is expected of anybody.
It's a problem with the narrative. It lacks the narrative that we love. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a resolution. So we want it to either be a tragedy or to end well, but within a shorter time span than chronic illness will allow.
Yeah.
So if we tell the story of our illness,
and I mean, I think that I've been doing a lot of reading now about chronic illness and disability studies, and came across this fantastic term, I guess it's TAB, right? So it's temporarily able-bodied. Mm-hmm. And so in fact, every able-bodied person in the world is only temporarily able-bodied, because eventually all of us, one way or another, it's just a question of time, but all of our bodies will deteriorate or fall apart or become less able, or I mean, for me, it's a fiction that's built into like a binary system that's all about the privileged and economically productive, and
I also think of a book that once really hit me by Barbara Ehrenreich, Smile or Die, where she recounts her experience going through the process of having breast cancer, and then starts to research, investigate the culture of positivity surrounding the support groups that she encounters, and also how medical care is giving her
Yeah.
soft pastel pink
Yeah.
thingies.
Yeah. There's a podcast called TLC Sessions. And it's the long COVID sessions, and it's put on by two women who are long haulers. And when I first started to listen to it, I was like, oh, this is amazing. Because first of all, it was hearing people talk, because mostly my experience with other people with long COVID is online, in reading and writing. But to hear people just casually talk, like, so how are you this week? Yeah, well, the earache and the tinnitus and this, and I had some of and they're just sort of like casually chit-chatting about everything that's going wrong in their body. And it was so refreshing, because it's just sort of like, and then this is, I mean, it's almost equal to like, and then I went to the shop and got some bananas, and, but it was just really like, oh my God. But it was such a like breath of fresh air to just have it be normal. Mm-hmm. Just like, yep, all right, this is what's going, and not this like, okay, or I'm also really tired this week, and I'm like,
you reading all these things at first and then hearing them as a podcast, did this feed into your performance with text at first and then a voice over? Am I rhyming those things correctly?
I think not in an overtly conscious way. No, not in a way that I'm necessarily aware of. Maybe. Of course, everything you encounter influences how you think and how you do. But specifically, in the way that I was dealing with the words on the placards, I was interested in kind of, presenting these like fragments of like a non-linear narrative because the experience of being so ill was like a confrontation of the impossibility, or felt like the impossibility of language or words to convey what was going on to family, to friends, to doctors, to whoever, and so kind of the usual rules of language just didn't apply. So something about like just presenting these like fragments of words that, like just little like glimmers, mm-hmm. and then with the voiceover stuff, that they're not fixed in time. They're just then these like little excerpts that it's not really clear over what period of time they come or when. But I don't know.
I would like to point out something. I've been off and on. We've known each other for years, and I've had to walk with a cane. I've had some physical issues. I'm almost 9 months into a torn ligament, and capitalism very much wants me to go back to work, but it's just not there yet. Non-linear. One of the things that I am noticing, you're using a lot of the same language that I have come across, mm-hmm. in relation to my various physical things, however long-term they've been. But there's also a lot of language that, certainly from the point of view of the looker, that is related to living in a fat body in a non-fat world. Mm-hmm. There's an extra layer, mm-hmm. in this performance for me, and I don't know if you're even aware of this, because we've talked a lot about bodies and perception of bodies over the years as well, and I don't know if that figured in, but I want to tell you that I see it here.
Okay.
And it's important somehow in a way that I can't quite verbalize yet.
Yeah.
I'm so curious what language that is. This is a layer I didn't see.
It's because the bodies live in.
Yeah, I understand. I see that this is a blind spot.
And this is the main reason that I want to point it out, because I'm sure that nobody else in this room is aware of this.
Yeah.
Even though you have the chronic illness experience, there's a whole other layer that I'm sure nobody's really aware of.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you were thinking of it, but like I know we talked about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, and like I'm not aware of it, and
Wow.
yeah.
And is it possible to tell us something about that layer to make me see it more clearly?
Well, we all
Like,
have
where's the
ideas
way
when
in
we
it?
look at a body. We all look at a body, and like we talk about this a lot. Like people have certain ideas when they look at Velvet's body about what they can do versus when they look at my body and what I can do. When in fact those ideas are very often not accurate.
Yeah. And I mean, and so what I would say about like this particular moment is that like, because maybe I have the same like question as you, but I think it's my responsibility to kind of go home and look at my placards and think about what do my placards say about body size that I'm not aware of, and that's my work to do rather than
about body size, but about the way that the people who are looking perceive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
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 It's not so much about your comment
Yeah.
on yourself,
Yeah.
but about the way that viewers perceive things.
Yeah.
So it's about assumptions that we are having because of.
Well, we make assumptions when we look at anybody.
Yeah, I'm just really curious about the. I'm just really hungry to get into more depth in this, but I also know this is not the place nor the time. But at least thank you for pointing it out.
Thank you all very much for being here and spending this time. Thank you so much, Wilbert, for this conversation, for your performance and the conversation we've had, and I hope this is going to continue.